Welcome to Kibbe on Liberty. Is Mexico becoming the new Venezuela? We asked that question of Roberto Salinas León, the director of Atlas Network's new project on Latin America. Check it out. She would organize the first
and only
meeting of Montpelier in Mexico City?
in Cancun.
Cancun.
January of 1996. It was supposed to be a regional meeting and turned out to be more like a general meeting.
Pull a little bit closer, there you go.
Everybody came, even though D.C. was hit with a huge snowstorm that prevented some of our best and brightest to be able to join us. But it was a fun program. It was the last time Julian Simon participated.
Oh, wow.
In an MPS meeting, because he died so young, right?
Yeah.
And no, it was great. It was great. Difficult to organize, but.
So give people a little bit of your background. I saw that you are a member of the Montpelier Society, which I am as well, which is where classical liberal economists and philosophers famously gathered in the darkest days after World War II to try to figure out how to revive the idea of freedom. But you also went to Hillsdale College, so
Yes.
we have some similarities. Give us a little bit of your background.
My family in Mexico has always been keenly interested in classical liberal ideas. My grandfather was a very important businessman there, and he financed the equivalent of fee in Mexico back then. And actually, Leonard Reed, Foundation for Economic Education, was good friends with Musso Ayao, who was also good friends with Agustin Navarro Vázquez. He was my professor in Mexico and is the person that got me into this. Well, he and my father. My father was an important contributor to the cause as well. And back in the day, there was a handful of 7, maybe 10 people, 15 at the most, and we had to exchange these ideas basically in silence and with a watchful eye to not making government terribly aware or terribly angry at what we were saying and doing. And so when I finished my degree, I later studied philosophy and political theory. And when I went back to Mexico in the late 80s and early 90s, this was when Mexico all of a sudden started thinking about trade with the rest of the world, price liberalization, get rid of price controls, get rid of industrial policy, try something new after a devastating cycle of currency crises and peso devaluation and runaway inflation, and it was just a disaster what Mexico suffered through between 1970 and especially 1982, and then the adjustment was extremely painful. And so this new breed of so-called technocrats comes in with Salinas de Gortari and his economic team, and later Ernesto Zedillo, that despite the trials and tribulations of Mexico, all of a sudden you're basically arguing for what you think are the right policies, such as open trade, such as much greater private participation in different sectors of the economy, telecom, energy, electricity, infrastructure, manufacturing, what have you. So that's part of what's got me very much into the mix of trying to support a certain policy and a certain intellectual stance in Mexico. Quite apart from everything that's happened, what I'm happy to say is that the 3rd and 4th generations of young kids that are coming today, we're no longer 3 or 7 or 15. It's more like maybe 400 or into the thousands, and they're kids and they're millennials that they flirt with all kinds of ideas, but at the bottom, I guarantee you that they have a libertarian core. And that's something very good to see.
I see that all over the world through the Atlas Network and through Students for Liberty and other organizations. I get a chance to speak all over the place, and particularly in places where there isn't necessarily a classical liberal tradition, a tradition of free market economics. There seems to be a lot of hunger And
A lot of hunger, yes.
and I think
indeed.
part of it is understanding what big government is actually all about. You've seen it. Your family has suffered under it, and the other part is your ability to Google alternatives. So I tend to be sort of wildly optimistic about the future of liberty everywhere, including Latin America. But you sort of wear at least two hats right now, and you may be a visiting professor as well. But you're president of the Mexico Business Forum.
Yes.
And are you based in Mexico City?
I'm based in Mexico City, and that's basically, it used to be part of the Economist Corporate Network, or the Economist Intelligence Unit, and the events that they ran, which is a much longer story, but it was a really cool way of trying to promote classical liberal ideas with a very mainstream type of brand. So back in the day, we had a lot of fun doing that, and I retained the name Mexico Business Forum, or they allowed me to retain the name, basically as a opportunity to promote both policy advisory and investment advisory, which is a practice I had or continue to have at some point. And recently with Atlas Network, I've joined their Center for Latin America as director, and what I think is a timely and wonderful effort that they're trying to put forward.
Tell us a little bit and by the way, there's apparently the president is flying over us because there's endless airplanes coming over our heads, but we will proceed forth anyhow. Tell us a little bit about the Atlas Network initiative, because you're not just working now in Mexico, but you're working across Latin America with partners who are focused on promoting free ideas in every country, right?
Yeah. And also in the U.S., and Canada, and trying to promote a much greater understanding of what's going on in Latin America. As it is, we can't talk about Latin America as a homogeneous region. It's every country has its different particularities and its different idiosyncrasies, and sometimes within those countries you have very different regions.
Yeah.
Certainly, that's the case with Mexico, where northern Mexico is much more North American than southern Mexico, which tends to be much more third world and backward. But there's always a fascinating tendencies to see in Latin America. But everywhere from the resurgence of populism and creeping statism in Mexico, to what you see with the migrant caravans throughout Central America. And despite our good friends at UFM in Guatemala, Universidad Francisco Marroquín, Guatemala itself has been facing tremendous challenges. Then you have El Salvador, where at one time you had these spectacular free market reformers that did some wonderful things there. And yet nowadays, once again, it seems to be back to the bad old status ways. Honduras, which is a basket case, even though that's one of the regions that has some of the most out-of-the-box and creative thinking that comes out of the free market world, using blockchain to protect private property rights and contracts. I mean, really, really cool stuff. And then perhaps Panama is a site that gives us some hope as far as the example is concerned. 20 years ago, Colombia was a basket case. It continues to be a basket case, but nevertheless, it has made such tremendous progress in taking the steps in the right direction as far as trying to consolidate a more open society. Venezuela, unfortunately, the way it's imploded, the changes in Brazil. And now Argentina, Chile, that is probably the country that is most. It would be the one that has the most claim to become a second world country throughout Latin America. And you mentioned this hunger before. Part of what we're trying to do at the center is basically to let our 90 plus institutions that are members of the Atlas Network to talk to each other. Basically, to facilitate conversation with each other, because that conversation leads to ideas about what's going on in Honduras that might help the institutes in southern Argentina, that perhaps might inspire somebody in the southern part of Brazil to maybe do something as far as an anti-crime program in Colombia, and also to increase networking with some of the magnificent institutions all throughout the United States and Canada. So I think it's a very timely and important effort.
And that's particularly specifically my agenda for today. Is I think we Americans probably don't spend enough time thinking about our friends to the south, specifically Mexico, but Latin America more generally. And I've always been a little mystified by that. We just spent trillions of dollars in 18 years and countless lost American lives trying to impose from the top down liberal democracy in Afghanistan. Mm-hmm. But I don't feel like, and I don't think that's a good model for Latin America, but I also think maybe we should spend a little more time paying attention, understanding the good things, the bad things, exploding some of the political mythologies created by our president and certainly presidents preceding Donald Trump. And I wanted to walk through all that today. I saw you speak in New York a couple days ago, and you particularly focused on a lot of the bad things that are happening with the new president in Mexico.
Yes, Mr. Andrés Manuel López Obrador.
He's a president who may have aspirations to be something more permanent. And how Venezuela got to where it was, and comparing the origins of Chavismo to the new Mexican president, it's pretty ominous if you look at these parallels. So I thought we might focus a little bit, but you got my attention, not just with that stuff, but apparently the Mexican president's party has proposed a ban on cold beer.
A ban on cold beer.
And those are fighting words for me. Like capitalism, socialism, this stuff really matters, but you'll pry that cold beer out of my dead hands. Why
That's really messing at a personal level, right?
Why would they do that? By the way, we brought some cold beer because we're going to flout the fact that for all of the things that we don't get right in the United States, I can have a cold beer whenever I damn well want it.
Yep.
And I feel like we should do it right now. Okay. So this is fans of this show will know that I'm obsessed with craft micro beer, and this is from one of my favorite breweries, The Vale. But it's a lager. You can get endless iterations of delicious cold beer in this country. Cheers.
As we say in Mexico, salud.
Salud.
That is cold.
Perfectly chilled. And I don't know what I would do if it was 100 degrees out. But what on earth, why would any government want to ban cold beer?
I think it's a demonstration of the type of thinking that Andrés Manuel López Obrador's party and his ilk has developed. I like to think, I'm sorry if I get a little bit philosophical here, but I like to think of López Obrador as a would-be, I think he thinks himself as a would-be Saint Benedict, mm-hmm. that is going to come and save society from the barbarians at the gate and turn people into virtuous citizens. And some of his followers may think that part of that virtue ethic involves, well, you can no longer drink beer because beer leads to diabetes and leads to bad things, or it leads to getting drunk or drunk driving, or it leads to things that are not approved by the imperial father, López Obrador. Even the name of his party is very revealing. It's the Movement of National Regeneration. And if you study those words carefully, that's a profoundly authoritarian concept. The idea that I'm going to regenerate the nation. It is not that it's going to regenerate itself through institutions and through checks and balances. No. I'm going to regenerate it. I, the leader of the party, am responsible. So he's almost like a notch above between the archangels and the rest of us common folk, and he is going to show us how that means that he has a monopoly on moral truth. So this is very much like a theocracy, almost like a primitive left-wing theocracy. Very much like the Chavismo. The first words that López Obrador said after he won was, "I belong to you, the nation," which is exactly what Chavez said at one point when he won the elections. "I no longer belong to myself. I now belong to you." And this is López Obrador wakes up every single day. You wake up here in the United States, and there's 2 or 3 tweets by Donald Trump, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. So that's been extremely innovative form of politics and communications. This guy wakes up, he has his national security briefing from 6 to 7, and then does a 2-hour press conference every single day. That's like a 2-hour tweet.
Yeah.
From 7 to 9. So what he does is he captures the narrative. And on one of those occasions, the narrative was the cold beer. Right. So, I mean, and the response was, well, I guess we'll have to have it lukewarm. One famous writer in Mexico, Sergio Sarmiento, says, "Don't mess with my beer."
Yeah. Yeah.
That was literally what he wrote. And he's a highly respected and widely read journalist, well known here in the United States as well. And he basically said, "I'm sorry." It was the senator from the Morena party. A woman who was introducing this piece of legislation is, "Sweetheart, don't mess with my beer."
Yeah.
And
there's a line. There's a line in the sand.
But the line is, you're really testing the limits when you go and consider that you're actually going to be telling people what they can drink. My son responded, "What is it? Now I'm going to have lukewarm beer instead of cold beer? Why not just beer outright? It would have made things easier." What's the difference between lukewarm and cold? Is there a certain degree that López Obrador's wisdom is going to be able to tell us exactly how I'm supposed to have beer, what beer I can sell and what beer I cannot sell? This is really, this is taking the fatal conceit of Hayek.
Yeah.
To absurdity. It's a reductio ad absurdum of the fatal conceit. But that's very much what this messianic mentality, and I know so much more than you do, and I'm going to teach you how to behave and how to be virtuous and a good boy or a good girl. That kind of mentality, those are the absurdities that it generates.
Well, you notice that your beer says beer is freedom. So we have very much used beer, and it turns out cold beer. I didn't even realize that was part of the metaphor that we were talking about. Beer is freedom because for me it started almost 2 years ago. I was reading an article about the one remaining brewery in Venezuela, Cerveza Polar, and they were announcing that they could no longer acquire the ingredients to make beer, and so sort of half jokingly we made a video talking about the socialist hellhole in Venezuela has now reached peak disaster, because if you are living in a socialist hellhole, you should at least have a cold beer.
At least, yeah.
At least. I mean, you probably need a whole 6-pack to get through the week. And of course, when you really dig into the story about why they couldn't get the ingredients to make beer, it turns out that it was socialist policies and hyperinflation and protectionism and all sorts of things that we know have created the problem in Venezuela. But, for people that don't really care about Mises and Hayek, you do notice when there's no beer on the shelf.
Well, I'll tell you something. There's another side to that story. And just as you mentioned, Matt, beer, I think, can be a very important symbol of the power of trade and the power of freedom. And actually, Mexican beer has now become world famous.
Yeah.
And I'm not just talking about Corona, which is not considered a good beer in Mexico, by the way.
Well,
it's hailed everywhere else.
I don't want to pick on Corona either, but it's not considered a good beer in some corners of my universe.
Their marketing has been spectacular.
Right.
Right?
Genius.
But now you have Indio, and now you have Montejo, and Pacifico, and Victoria, and Dos Equis, and you can go into any of these wonderful beer places, as you can go into the bars today, and you see the vast variety of tequila or mezcal. Beer is a good example of what open trade with the rest of the world does to human beings.
Yeah.
We've been able to turn it into a fantastic export opportunity, but it also has enabled to generate the resources to be able to import a whole lot of what we couldn't do before. And so in that sense, trying to regulate the temperature of beer, no less, not beer itself, the temperature of beer, speaks to the hostility to open markets and let people decide. Let them be free to choose if they want it cold, lukewarm, and what kind of beer they want. They want Bud. Our artisanal beers,
Craft.
Cervezas artesanales, as we call them in Mexico, they're the great new thing. And you have these kids that are developing and are beginning to find markets, not just in Mexico, but also abroad. And some have failed, but some are already successful. You have Cerveza Allende that is beginning there, and some that are mixed with mezcal, and that's the spontaneous order of the market trying to find a new niche, a new opportunity, a new way of making consumers happier. So it is really offensive from a liberty point of view to pretend that you know what temperature I could drink my beer at.
Yeah, that's and that broader context of protectionism is a core part. It seems of the new Mexican agenda.
I would say autarky, because they don't want to mess around with the trade agreement, especially the one with the United States and Canada, knowing full well that it could occasion a massive short circuit very quickly and very violently in integrated supply chains. And I didn't want to focus. Beer is an example of, if they do it with cold beer, imagine what they're going to do with rules of origin on auto parts, or what are the import-export conditions on avocado, mangoes, fruits, flowers, blueberries. Mexico has become a world-famous exporter of blueberries, or whether we can import technologies from abroad, and under what conditions we could import them. Because the government of López Obrador has not had any shame in admitting that they would like to basically follow the model of autarky, autosuficiencia, self-sufficiency in energy, in foodstuffs, in infrastructure, and basically Mexico is for Mexicans. And that, for a highly integrated economy as Mexico has been during the past 25 years, is not going to lead anywhere good.
But that theme, like, it's and I looked up this guy, and some people compare him to Donald Trump, and other people compare him to Bernie Sanders, and
they're both right.
And they're both right. And they're both right. And one of those things is sort of that zero-sum game, nationalist, anti-trade mentality that by trading with other countries, you lose. And of course, the opposite is true, but that seems to be on the rise. It seems to be on the rise in Mexico. Certainly, it is part of the Venezuelan model. Like explicitly sort of blocking things from coming in and blocking people from leaving is part of what the Maduro regime has imposed. But how do we explain to people the mutually beneficial nature of trade? How would you explain it if you're making this argument in Mexico?
I don't have to go very far in Mexico to make the argument. What the nationalism that is tends to be more pervasive in Mexico has to do with certain strategic sectors, like energy, that is near and dear to our heart, the oil. And the oil is ours. It's not yours. Of course, there's no investment to develop it, and nobody's going to go into deep waters and invest the billions of dollars that you need in order to develop it, which is one of the reasons that Mexico undertook an energy reform in the last administration. That administration, because it also very unfortunately got mired into a whole cycle of corruption and impunity. And now people say, well, it's because of the energy reform and corruption and impunity. So there's it's failure by association, or it's false by association. But that's actually a misleading argument. But I would tell you that as far as trade is concerned, despite this romance and this nostalgia for the autarky of Mexico, you have far broader support. It's only the occasional extreme academic that is going to be against free trade, even with the United States, because you see the enormous advantages that is brought, not just from the side of exports. Mexico exports, very few Americans know this, but Mexico exports $1 billion of manufactured products per day, which is already, as it is, an incredible sum. But in GDP, once you calculate it in terms of the differences in GDP between the United States and Mexico, it's a formidable amount. So trade today represents more than 70% of Mexico's economy. It's tied to global trade itself. So that's exports. But it also imports a formidable amount. Mexico buys more from Texas alone than the rest of the 49 states of the United States buy from Texas alone. That's a staggering figure.
Yeah.
That's into the hundreds of billions of dollars. And that shows you that there is purchasing power south of the border. Now, they did this freely and voluntarily. They weren't coerced to do it. It's not because I'm winning and you're losing. No, you're buying stuff. Right? Alabama doesn't lose because it buys stuff from Connecticut, or Oregon loses because it buys stuff from Florida. No, you trade between. Nobody loses any sleep if there's a trade deficit between California and New York. Well, maybe in California and New York they do, but why think in terms of the balance of payments or some fake macroeconomic notion? What you have to look at, go to the border. That's what I would tell the United States people. Go to the border. Go to citizens of Juarez or Laredo, Nuevo Laredo, Juarez, and El Paso. Despite the violence, despite the ugliness, despite the heat, despite everything, you see people trading stuff and going back and forth every single day. And they consider themselves part of a single region. What they would like to see is all these transaction costs going away so that they could facilitate what? Greater trade, because they know that if you're able to buy in Nogales, at the Walmart in Nogales, the same television station that you can buy in Nogales, Sonora, instead of Nogales, Arizona, you do it in Nogales, Sonora, then it depends on the exchange rate and where the television is cheaper. And the consumer is going to do what? Buy a better product at a better price. And that's freedom to choose. And that's what the United States economy is supposed to be all about. So to go against, to now be protectionist and say that the Mexicans have stolen our jobs and have done this to us, they've done a lot of bad things, and as the U.S. has done bad things, but it's not about trade. Let them worry about trade. Let responsible adults engage in capitalist acts as far as trade is concerned. That's the last area that we should be concerned about.
Yeah, it's genuinely mystifying to me. I talked to your colleague Elena Toledo from Honduras, and she was talking about, and we were talking about the caravans that originate in Honduras and work their way through Mexico. And Trump has, of course, made a big deal about this invasion. But you and I know that people don't pack up their families and walk halfway across a continent because they want to. They do it out of desperation. They do it because they don't have an opportunity to feed their children at home. So it seems to me that if we want to do something about that sort of economic migration, if we're worried about that, we might focus more on expanding trade, not limiting trade.
Exactly. And it's not just expanding trade, because that's only one of many other conditions. But it certainly does contribute toward
it's one that we could control
yes.
through U.S. policy, at least
yes.
not restrict it.
And I think you could say the same thing if you want to liberate Venezuela quickly, engage in not sanctions, engage in greater trade. I would argue the same thing about Cuba. I think Cuba has and when goods travel, Matt, you know better this better than anybody. When goods travel, ideas also travel. And with those ideas, that's what gets traction going as far as being able for people to discover new things and new worlds and new possibilities. Today, you go to the border or the northern states in Mexico, and they're a radically different country or region than they were 25 or 30 years ago. You have agricultural zones that turned into world-class manufacturing centers. You have some of the most spectacular tourism opportunities, whether it's Baja California or whether it's the Riviera Maya, or even in the Pacific and also on the Atlantic coast of Veracruz. You have some of the most innovative real estate developments that have occurred. That some of them were even able to survive the housing crisis and the real estate crisis in 2009 and 2008 and 2009, and it doesn't matter if you're PRI or you're Morena or you're PAN or whatever. If you're in the north, you're going to want to trade because that's what it's all about. That's what trade is all about. The main worry there has to do with security, rule of law, protection of contracts, and protection of property rights. And people are finally talking about this. Why? Because now they found out that it's relevant to what? To trade.
Yeah.
To trade. So that's one of the unintended consequences of beneficial unintended consequences of open trade is that people that have no ideological orientation, that may have never read Hayek or Friedman or even some of our great Latin American thinkers, Alberti and Sarmiento and Jose Maria Luis Mora, all of a sudden become conscious that, gee, it's important to have a long-term, reliable contract in order to be able to secure a transaction. It's no longer going to be the graft and the wheeling and dealing. It still is, unfortunately. But for the big operations, no way.
Let's go back and since we're taking on trade and certainly some of my conservative viewers are more skeptical. They think that Donald Trump is just negotiating a better deal. But let's talk about sanctions and let's talk about the U.S. response to Maduro and Venezuela. I agree with you. I think sanctions very much entrench the authoritarians we're trying to combat. Explain the logic for people that don't buy that.
Well, sanctions are supposed to hurt the people, and they do hurt the people. But let's say the regular mom and pop in Venezuela that are hurt by the economic sanctions, they're now weaker, right? Mm-hmm. That means that relative to those in power are now stronger.
Yeah, yeah.
And so to them to those in power, to the Cuban regiment that is now basically sequestered Nicolas Maduro and his polity in Venezuela. Basically, what you're doing is you're indirectly empowering them by making the potential opposition weaker. We saw this during the so-called humanitarian crisis. Actually, instead of it's very hypocritical of the Maduro regime to say, "Oh, but these sanctions." Well, what do you think? What you yourself did by burning the trucks that came in with humanitarian aid? You yourself imposed a sanction, because you didn't want those people to be able to have a greater wherewithal in the midst of this tremendous and rampant misery.
They use food as a weapon.
They use food. They weaponize electricity shortages, and they weaponize food shortages, and this is what's worked in Cuba. It's worked in North Korea. It's part and parcel of the new authoritarianism. I don't think Mexico could get to that. I don't think. I think but then again, nobody ever thought Venezuela would be where they are.
Yeah.
And Venezuela, the greatest harm to Venezuela has come from the brutal hemorrhage of human capital. The great minds, the great Venezuelan minds that have fled looking for whatever, wherever. If you go to a place like Miami, and this is partially what gets your conservative friends and my not-so-friends angry, is that you go to Miami, basically the financial industry there, and it's all Venezuelans. They're all legally established, and they're all become legalized, but they're Venezuelan origin. And they're never going to go back. They're never, ever going to go back. Some of the greatest minds and the greatest writers today, historians, philosophers, logicians, mathematicians, they come from Venezuela. In finance, they're spectacular. In retail, they've done some tremendous work. Some of the examples here in the United States that also the immigration issue that has become so sensitive and so offensive to many. You think if you Google who's the best chef in the world in 2019, it's a Mexican. Where's that Mexican living? It's a woman that studied under Enrique Olvera, the famous chef in Mexico, that has a restaurant where? In New York. she should be back home generating employment and value added. So people don't talk about the benefit that this woman is bringing here and the loss that we're having in terms of the opportunity cost of having exported that human capital, or of Dr. Q, the famous Dr. Q in Los Angeles that operates cancerous brain tumors from people that come all over the world because he's considered one of the top 3 cancer neurosurgeons in the world and used to be a tomato picker. He came into the United States illegally. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm in favor of illegal immigration. I hate the fact that my brothers and sisters from Mexico are crossing the river and crossing into zones that sometimes they get shot just because they shouldn't be there. But if we look at it from a purely rational or non-emotional point of view, immigration has enormous benefits. I think that represents a great policy challenge of how to be able to accommodate the market needs of immigration in the United States and these migrant caravans and those that are looking for opportunities. They're also looking for opportunities where there are opportunities, right?
Yeah.
Canada seems to have, we hardly ever talk about Canada, but Canada seems to have a more flexible regime despite all their inflexibilities in other areas.
Nobody is illegally crossing the border into Venezuela today.
Nobody's illegally crossing the border into Venezuela or into North Korea or into Cuba. Maybe it'll be one of these very confused academics. There's a fantastic economist specializes in human capital, the economics of education and human capital, Kevin Murphy of Chicago. He was in Mexico recently, and he said, if they end up building the wall for the sake of the United States, I hope it's really tall and really big, because it'll take somebody really intelligent and really good to come across. And that's the kind of human capital that we need in the United States. That's the kind of person that will contribute to value added and to a growing economy, a prosperous and inclusive economy, a sharing economy. Obviously, he said it in an ironic fashion, but I think it was very revealing to show that no, you should be welcoming this capital rather than turning it into a political time bomb, which it has been.
So my theory on the wall and enhanced efforts to stop illegal immigration is that, and conservatives love to say that walls work, and I think at the margin, walls work.
Ronald Reagan certainly didn't think so, but
but walls work in their context for, like, we're gonna stop the flow of illegal immigration, and I think at the margin it probably discourages that family looking to come to this country to work and to follow the laws and to do the things they want to do. But certainly the people that are not discouraged would be, say, violent drug gangs who are making substantial money by getting their products, and it's not just drugs, but it's all the things that Donald Trump says is happening. Do you buy that? Do walls not only discourage good people from coming, but actually make it more profitable for bad people to figure out a way across?
They increase the price of meth and cocaine at the retail level. That's all it does.
Yeah.
Because they'll find a way, and as long as you have this voracious demand, or if you have people wanting to consume something, I think we should be thinking more about the health aspect and about intelligent policies that contemplate liberalization, or maybe through zones. I don't know. In theory, I would like for all of it to be decriminalized.
Yeah.
That's my personal point of view. And I promise you, that personal point of view is also shared by extremely Catholic house mothers and taxi drivers and soccer players and taco stand owners. It seems to have become conventional wisdom. Why? Because when you have over 30,000 people that are murdered, and 90% or 95% of that is gang wars, all these horrendous stories about bloodshed, decapitations, and mutilations and whatnot, those are basically gangs sending symbols between them. Don't mess with me. Don't mess with my turf. Mm-hmm. And that is as a result of the extremely high profit margins that are occasioned by the prohibition in the United States, in Europe, in Canada, but fundamentally in the U.S. So if you put a wall, all you're doing is increasing the price. It's inelastic, right? It's not going to vary.
Right.
You're just going to, instead of the gram of cocaine that goes for 200 or 300 or whatever, and it's now 350. So thank you, Señor Trump. Muchas gracias.
Yeah.
Because you're certainly not going to stop them, and that will empower them. This is not an easy solution. And as far as illegal immigrants, let me tell you, man, empirical studies have shown, and it can be the Democrat Bordernomics, or it could be the Migration Policy Institute and the great work that that Andrew Selly's doing there, or it can be El Colegio de la Frontera del Norte. They're going to tell you the Bush Institute published a fantastic study a few years ago by Matt Denhart showing 70% of illegal immigrants from Mexico, they come in on a low-cost flight and they overextend their welcome. So now planes usually fly over walls.
We're talking like a high wall to stop that.
It would have to be like, really high wall.
A really high wall.
And so no, what you need to do is rather compliance has to be easier, and you need to think about schemes where you make the people willing to participate. And if you want to control migratory flows, well, then you're going to have to be able to participate in lotteries and so make the illegal the exception to the rule. And actually, for every illegal immigrant going across the border into the United States today, the tendency in the past 10 years has been 3 Mexicans coming back.
Yeah.
So those roles have reversed.
Yeah.
But that's another story altogether.
So we need, and I think there's confusion on both sides of the political aisle here. Bernie Sanders has complained about the so-called open border policies of libertarians and the Koch brothers, and in a lot of ways he sounds like Donald Trump when he talks about that kind of stuff. But there are some basic economics that could inform our policies in Mexico specifically, and I think you mentioned it, and I would double down on that. Ending the drug war is probably the most immediately consequential way of pulling the rug out from under violent drug cartels, and that immediately has an impact on the rule of law and the violence that we see in a lot of countries in Latin America that are along that drug food chain leading right up to the border. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I do agree with that.
Yeah.
And there's some proposals that have been fielded just for the sake of conceptual argument that maybe what Mexico should do is they should help the DEA or the health dependency, the health state organization in charge or whatever, to subsidize the price of cocaine so that it's zero, because there's no way they could compete with that.
Yeah.
Now, you would have a hell of a health problem, but the violence, you eradicate it. All the violence surrounding cocaine, you eradicate it from day one. So it's a conceptual exercise. It's a thought experiment, right? If Mexico devoted so much money to finance that anybody wanted cocaine could get it in the wherever in the different states at zero, the demand would increase substantially. But as a thought experiment, it works very very neatly, because you put the drug lord out of business, and those margins. Drug lords today are typical examples of the type of protected crony market. So it's not even the quality of their product. It's the fact that they've cornered the market through prohibitions, through legal prohibitions, through legal discrimination, and so I don't think drug decriminalization is a magic wand. I do share the Kevin Murphy or Gary Becker idea that let's give this a shot. It certainly has a better chance than the drug war, which has produced in Mexico 35,000 lives per year, and has occasioned just a tremendous opportunity cost and bloodshed and fear and concern, and so let's give it 10 years and see what the results are. If in 10 years we find out that the health problem is insurmountable or whatnot, then we can revisit our strategies. I know that politically it's going to be very difficult, but never in my mind I thought that in my lifetime I would see a push towards marijuana legalization. And one thing that López Obrador is doing in Mexico and seriously considering is legalizing all parts of the marijuana market.
Yeah.
And that I think would be a good thing.
Well, we had an experiment that we've talked about on this show in Portugal, and the data in the last 20 years, Portugal was infamously the worst place by any measure in terms of drug deaths, drug violence, illness, young people using drugs. And by decriminalizing everything, all the data got better. They went from the worst in the EU to the best in terms of violence and death and all of that stuff. But it is even in very conservative states like Utah in this country, they just passed a referendum that legalized medical cannabis. So there's
even there.
Yeah, even there. And it was wildly supported, popular with Republicans in the state of Utah. So I think in a lot of ways marijuana is kind of a done deal in this country. That the people are there. The Trump administration has very mixed opinions on this. In some ways they want to ramp up the drug war. In other ways, Trump himself has supported certainly medical cannabis and other things as well. You said something earlier, and I think this is an important thing that I wanted to drill down on. It. Most people, I think, are shocked that Venezuela has gotten so bad. And you could go all the way back to the origins of Hugo Chavez, and he certainly didn't sell himself as a socialist. He was a populist, and he was going to return the Bolivar's revolution kind of thing. But things got bad, and it was one thing after another. You say that Mexico can't go there, but how do we make sure that doesn't happen?
Let me hedge that by saying I hope Mexico doesn't go there, and I don't think that, given the conditions, it could materialize into the implosion and deterioration that Venezuela is suffering. So here are my thoughts about it. Hugo Chavez won, like López Obrador did, on a ticket of disenfranchisement. In other words, I speak for the disenfranchised, for those that are fed up with the oligopolies, the establishment, the privilege, what he calls in Spanish the fifis. Fifis is like the bad yuppies, sort of the Gordon Gekko style.
It's like the elites.
But really just the nauseating elites that have been able to get rich on the expense of you, which in a sense they have because of monopoly privileges.
Sure.
So those oligarchs, I mean, there were several in the classical liberal movement that actually praised the fact that Chavez had gotten into power because they were fed up with the way that oligarchs represented themselves as spokespersons for the market and for openness and whatnot. And that was leading us nowhere. And so once he does that, he comes out of the closet. He says he's a Bolivarian socialist, and he's going to impose a socialist revolution. But really, I think the socialism was just an excuse to cement power. It's a man sick with power. And I think López Obrador is very much what Enrique Krause, famous historian in Mexico, classical liberal historian in Mexico, called the tropical messiah. So very much a messiah, but from the tropical state of Tabasco.
Yeah.
So there's a little uses and customs from Tabasco infused into this populism. That's why I mentioned St. Benedict and the local community, and they teach you how to be virtuous. And so I think that Chavez had the enormous luck of being in a country, first of all, that was young, like Mexico is today, and second, that 80% of the economy depended on petroleum. So this was an economy very much energy linked. And of course, when he comes into power in 1999, 1998, 1999, that's when the big boom, commodity boom starts. And so he's enjoying a fresh source of new capital coming in in a degree that Mario Vargas Llosa has calculated that it's the greatest failed experiment in the history of the world of the amount of money that it could have made Venezuela from an investment point of view, could have turned Venezuela into a first world country in one generation. And it was squandered away with handouts and with political patronage and whatnot. So I like to compare it to the trust fund child effect of a sort of a fool, very much of a fool in the family that is wasting his or her trust fund, but has that continuous flow to do all the bad things that you're not supposed to do over and over and over and over and over again. The same thing happened in Argentina with high commodity prices. It's sort of the morphine that kept coming in was hiding all the really bad things that were going on in terms of the legal reforms or the policy initiatives. López Obrador does not have that luxury. And the first thing, the number one source of income in the United States of Mexico, los Estados Unidos Mexicanos, are exports. And exports are highly diversified. Oil exports abroad, and it's only crude. We import, believe it or not, I bet you most of our audience does not know this. Mexico imports 70% of its refined products from the United States. We buy most of our gasoline comes from the United States. Our shortages that we had at the beginning of the year was because of a stupid public policy. Oh, we're independent and we're autarky and we're not going to depend from the U.S. Okay, so now you're going to have to be in line for 3 hours in order to, in Mexico City, the largest city of the world. Imagine that, the kind of damage that did. If your country is highly diversified in that sense, I'm not saying it's an automatic check, but it's going to be the damage is going to be far more instantaneous. There's no morphine there. On the contrary, what you're doing is
there's no free money to hand out. There's no cash flow to buy votes, and
unless you expropriate the central bank, and then all hell breaks loose.
Things fall apart.
Things fall apart very quickly.
Yeah.
In an age of high capital mobility, which is what a lot of López Obrador's people have not understood. That capital, it's quicksilver and it's vicious and virulent. And capital doesn't sleep. It's 24/7, 365 days a year. And it doesn't matter if it's in a factory or in a T-bill. It goes.
Well, I think we all agree that we don't want Mexico to go the way of Venezuela. And so the homework for anybody watching or listening today is figure out how we expand free trade with Mexico, figure out how we pull the rug out from under the drug lords, and spend a little bit of time understanding how our economies are actually integrated, and what hurts one hurts the other, and also, that hurts workers everywhere.
Look, one additional thing, Matt, to back that up is look at everything that's happened in the southern the United States. Whether you have a Democrat governor or you have a Democrat municipal president of let's say of a town like Phoenix or Tampa or you have Jim Abbott in Texas, they've all become spokespersons of Mexico and doing damage control. Why? Because there's business at stake. There's very important business at stake. And San Diego is fully integrated with Tijuana. San Diego's gorgeous. Tijuana is horrendous. But they even have a cross-border bridge nowadays where people can come and forth. You pay $5 and they vet you and you can come and go as you please. And depending on where you're going, you can take a flight from the San Diego airport or take a flight from the Tijuana airport. So this does not discriminate between your political orientation. It's just good business to expand. If you can sell more and buy more on both sides of the border, that's common sense.
Roberto Salinas León, thank you for this. And let's have some more cold beer.
I'd love to. Thank you. It's a great opportunity.
Thanks for watching Kibbe on Liberty. By now, you know this is the most important event of your week. So make sure you subscribe on YouTube. Click the little bell so you get notifications. Kibbe on Liberty, mostly honest conversations with mostly interesting people.